Your Excellency, Honorable Mr. Paichu, sorry, Honorable Ms. Hancock, Ms. Cook, Honorable District Governor Nikola Božić, elected DRR Mirko Stojković, dear brothers and sisters, dear guests, welcome to the regular meeting of the Rotaract Club Belgrade Dedinje, in which we have our dear guests with us. So with this, I will start the meeting. And I will give the word to Dragana because she will be moderating this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Before we start with our lectures from the ambassador, Mr. Richard, Mr. Kathy, and of course, Mr. Bojan Bajić, I would like to hear and give a word to our governor, Mr. Nikola Božić. Please applause.
Good evening. Good evening, Your Excellency, our lecturers, dear fellow Rotarians and Rotaractors. This is a very important event for us. This is an event that is presenting Rotary, sharing true values of Rotary. On one hand, we have a history and tradition. On another hand, we have culture, cooperation, and friendship. Rotary as an international organization existing for more than a century is presenting all of this. I'm very thankful to the Embassy of Australia and to our Rotaract community that they are bringing us this cooperation, this event of cultural exchange, and this opportunity to host all of you on this occasion. I had opportunity to meet His Excellency a few weeks ago, presenting him our visit to Melbourne in the end of May, because Melbourne will be the capital of Rotary for 1 week. It will be opportunity to the whole Rotary world to be there at Rotary International Convention. More than 20,000 Rotarians from all continents will be there. Our district will be there, so Serbia and Montenegro will be presented there. We will present our global grants, our projects, and we will present everything that we already done and everything that we are planning to do. Shortly, because official language of our district is Serbian, I will switch to Serbian. Dragi prijatelji u Rotariju, hvala vam na ovom dolasku. Dragi dolazeći DRR-u, dragi predsjedniče Rotaract kluba, draga predsjednice Rotary kluba Beograd Dedinje, dragi ostali predsjednici Rotary i Rotaract klubova, dragi rotarijanci, rotarijanke, ovo je ono što Rotary jeste. Sa jedne strane, negujući tradiciju i istoriju, sećajući se prošlosti, gledamo kako danas možemo da kreiramo bolju budućnost. Onu budućnost na koju ćemo biti ponosni kada na nju budemo gledali kao na prošlost. Jer to je ona budućnost koju mi sada možemo da formiramo, to je ona budućnost na koju mi sada možemo da utičemo našim razmišljanjima, našim delovanjem, a nadam se da ćemo u momentu kada se budemo na nju osvrnuli kao na prošlost biti ponosni, kao što ćemo večeras biti ponosni na saradnju i u vrlo nezgodnim i teškim trenucima na saradnju između Australije i naše zemlje. Hvala Rotaract klubu Beograd Dedinje, hvala Rotary klubu Beograd Dedinje, hvala District Rotaract Representative Electu na ovoj prilici i iskoristite gde god možete, kako god možete to što je Rotary globalna organizacija. ovde u našoj zemlji tako što ćemo naše kontakte staviti na raspolaganje i dovesti sjajne predavače i goste, upoznati prelepe kulture u kojima smo bili ili sa kojima se nismo susretali ili jesmo, ali i putovati i otići tamo gde Rotarija ima bilo gde u svetu. Sa srećom, and thank you very much once again, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Božić. As you already know, the topic of this event is friendship between Australia and Serbia in World War I. So now I will have the opportunity to announce the person who dedicated many years of his life searching forgotten truth. Also, one of the underappreciated stories is about Sergeant Olive Kelso-King. Later, you will see an exhibition about her in the hotel lobby. The idea of Rotaract Club Belgrade Dedinje is to, of course, in the cooperation with the Australian Embassy and other clubs in our district, to create a traveling exhibition about Olive, the ways of her canteens for the poor and disabled, which she founded all over Yugoslavia after the World War I. As for Olive, and also other heroes, I'm certain that Mr. Pajć will tell us a bit more about that. So, please, applause for Mr. Pajć.
While I was in the army, we had to do military history, and that got me onto the military side as well as just general history. And but then, as I started to realise that all those photographs in my family albums meant something, there were people in uniform, my grandfather and great uncle, and I realised they were in the Serbian army, and they were in something called First World War, or the Balkan Wars even before, and it just sort of stayed in the background. I started to realise that there were Australians involved in Serbia in World War I as well, and that started me on a fairly long journey of digging up interesting people who had served in Serbia or with the Serbs in World War I, which was almost totally unknown generally here in Australia.
It's it's very, very close, Boyan. In fact, it's a week today when I fly out.
I know,
so,
you're going ahead of me, aren't you? Yeah.
I am, so I arrive a full day ahead of you, so I've got the luxury of perhaps having an extra night or so sleep ahead of you flying in. I guess we'll have a little bit of elevation there though, won't we, where I did see around Anissa and so on in the southern areas that it's probably a little bit cooler, but we'll cope.
No, you're right. We are going south, but we're going up as well. You're right. Yes, when we go to the battlefield of Dobropolje, which is the good field, that will be up in the hills, and it will be cooler. And Kama Challenge the same, can be pretty windy, so I'd make sure you've got a parka or something that you can put on. First Australians that arrived in Serbia in late 1914 were mainly women. In many cases, for example, in the example of the Scottish women's hospitals, these were women who came from a background of being suffragettes. We have an Australian who became a famous author afterwards, Stella Miles Franklin, after who is the named the highest literary award in Australia. Miles Franklin volunteered to serve in one of these Scottish women's hospitals with Mary de Garris, who is great niece is coming with me to Belgrade. One of the most awful things that I learnt and then I've been telling other people through these books and so on is that Serbia suffered the highest rate of death proportionate to population of all participants in World War I.
Although Koki came from a very privileged and wealthy family, none of them felt that was of any great value in itself. There wasn't a sense of this is a really superior way to live. There was a real sense that it was something given, not something they owned. And thinking about Cocky in her life in Serbia, which was the happiest time of her life, I think that just epitomises that she, and we too, we don't hold on to that privileged background. It's like the real world is about real people, and I think Cocky really felt that. And she so loved Serbia and so loved those people that she lived with and worked with.
The medal, it's a Royal Order of St Sava, is given to people who are contributed in humanitarian sort of way to the betterment of the Serbian people.
So here's a picture that was taken in the First World War.
Yeah.
And you can see the British Red Cross flag there.
Yeah.
So this was their accommodation, and this was another place where the patients were operated on. They had a third building as well called a Villa Avila.
Yeah.
And I've seen Villa Avila, I think.
Well, it's in that. You've got it.
We've got it in this book over here.
Here too.
Because when I was there in 2009, I met Jelena Dimic, who wrote this book.
Yeah.
And so here are these two buildings again.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to pronounce them, boy, and those names. How do you pronounce them?
That's Latibor. Yeah. So.
And the one on top.
Is Shumadir, I think.
I never saw these. I took notice of them when I was there before. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what they look like now, because these were places that Ethel with her Red Cross unit were working from and living in.
No, it's fantastic. I really look forward to seeing them. And so lucky that they still exist.
I think it was the love of her life. That was the feeling that was around in the family, and that both his family and her very conservative father were not in favour of the match becoming a marriage. And it was seen to be a sadness about her that both our father and his other sister Hazel would talk about, and it was just obviously somebody that she was deeply in love with.
One of the, I think, beneficial aspects of this is that the way it has transformed the idea of what women could do in war. And this comes out by talking to descendants now as they are realising the depth of the service and the sacrifice that was involved.
Kay McChallen, October 1916. The snow falls harshly on their chilling limbs, that ere the passing of a few short hours pulsed full of eager life. Oh God, if I were God, I'd open wide the door of heaven and make it rain soft flowers, sweet with the breath of their own blackbirds' plain. Sun-kissed and glowing to make warm again the last retreat of those who fight no more. Hast thou no mercy? Even mankind knows that might should ever help to weakness show. And yet, thou God Almighty, didst allow these helpless heroes here to give their lives, here when but a few hours' march from home.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So that was obviously a little trailer for our trip to Serbia of a few days ago. We all arrived here, and it was really just telling us what we're going to do on the trip. And the ladies that you saw being interviewed were nieces of Olive King, which the ambassador will speak about a bit later. But we're here just to talk to you about the book that is being that was launched yesterday at the History Museum. It's part of 3 books that I've launched over the last 7 years. The first book is what's called Serbian Decorations Through History and Medals Awarded to Australians, and that focused on the history of Serbian medals and those Australians who received them. It aims to inform Australians about Serbian orders and medals. The second book, Our Forgotten Volunteers, Australians and New Zealanders with Serbs in World War I, is a comprehensive history of the involvement of Australians and New Zealanders in the Serbian campaign of World War I. It provides the historical detail and the biographies of many of the participants. The book was launched yesterday in Serbian, The Australians with Serbs in World War I, and it's a look at the topic from the point of view of artworks, paintings, lithographs, sketches, photographs, placards, and objects such as plaques and medals. It also focuses on some individual Australians who served with the Serbs and who came from the regions of Australia, such as South Australia, Victoria and Queensland. So let's look very quickly at who these Australians were that served with the Serbs. I have broken them up into several categorisations, and we'll just go through briefly as to who these people were and how they came to be in Serbia. So if we can have the next slide. When the war started, voluntary organisations in Britain and in other countries formed to help Serbia, and other allied countries did the same. But Australians joined the organisations, and these included the Red Cross, the Serbian Relief Fund, which was an organisation set up by Serbs but with the help of other people in London to fund medical missions to go to Serbia. There was other organisations such as the Wounded Allies Relief, the Scottish Women's Hospitals for Foreign Service, the Royal Free Hospital Mission, and so on. Australians were part also of the British Military Hospital, which came and worked with the Serbian Army. So why did they join? In the main, it was a sense of duty that women and others wanted to come and join, but also as Serbia defended itself successfully in 1914 from the invasions of that year, Serbia became perceived as a very plucky country, somebody that should be helped to further defend itself. So the next slide. So 2 Australian Army units were involved in the Serbian campaign. One in the fighting in Serbia itself, and another one supplying mules through the port of Salonika. But more Australians were also part of the British forces in Serbia and on the Salonika front. They served as soldiers, aircrew and seamen. Australians were involved with British forces accompanying French forces that advanced into Serbia in November 1915 to try unsuccessfully to link up with the Serbian army, which was at that time fighting the invasion from German, Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian forces further north and west. Next slide. One of the medical units supporting the Serbian army on the border between then Serbia and Greece was a unit of the Scottish Women's Hospitals led by Australian women doctors with Australian, New Zealand, British and Canadian staff. We can see on the next slide, we can also see where this hospital was situated. This is a shot from the top of, or near the top of Kajmakchalan, and you can see Lake Ostrovo in the distance. And this field hospital, led by Australians and by Australian women in particular, was situated there in the background of the Serbian army, which was fighting on the hills in the mountains. The lady that was in the previous photo, Dr. Agnes Bennett, with Regent Alexander, the Crown Prince. And I will also let Kathy speak about who took over from her as the Chief Medical Officer of that field hospital. And tomorrow we are actually heading for the so-called Salonika front battlefields, and we will try to get up the top of Kajmakchalan and Dobropolje so that we could see where these people served and where Kathy's aunt served. The next slide shows several hundred Australian Army nurses also served in the port of Salonika. And they served in British general hospitals, but the French and British general hospitals also treated Serbian soldiers. So there was a mass of basically women nurses from Australia that were recruited to come, and they were directed to go to Salonika and support the forces that were there, which consisted mainly of three armies, the French, the Serbs and the British. Later there were contingents from Italy and Russia, and then right towards the end of the war the Greeks also joined formally as part of the Allied forces there. And then, next slide. 6 Australian destroyers served as part of the British fleet, supporting the armies and carrying out anti-submarine warfare. The Australian ships were engaged in an attempt to block German and Austro-Hungarian submarines from exiting the Adriatic Sea and entering the Mediterranean to attack Allied shipping. One of the ships took part in bombarding the Austro-Hungarian-held port of Drach when the final offensive took place in September 1918. Australians also served on merchant ships carrying supplies and in hospital ships evacuating the wounded. I quote one letter about this dreadful state of some Serbian wounded who were evacuated by these hospital ships from the Albanian shore to North Africa, and they were also evacuated obviously to other parts like Corsica. Next slide. The Australian Army recruited South Slavs in Australia who volunteered to serve in the Serbian Army. I've identified 88 such men, which is not a large force, but significant politically, because here, as we can see, Regent Crown Prince Alexander greeted and welcomed these men. These people were of so-called South Slavs, so it could Serbs, Montenegrins, Croats, Dalmatians, even Czechs and so on. And these people volunteered, or they chose to go into the Serbian army rather than stay in a concentration camp where they were arrested as enemy aliens when the war started. But anyway, they were handed over and joined the Serbian army, so they're another significant element. And next slide. At Dobropolje in September 1918, where we hope to get up to when we go there, the advance that took, led by the Serbian army, broke through the enemy front and advanced into Serbia. But the Scottish Women's Hospital unit that we talked about followed the Serbian army and actually stationed itself in then Serbia, in Vranje, for another year, treating wounded, but treating also people who were sick with all sorts of things, including the flu, which started to ravage all populations everywhere. Some also stayed and went to other places like Niš and in Belgrade, several Australians in various capacities, including being in sort of children's orphanages in Niš and so on. Next slide. Serbia also decorated, I've counted so far, 154 Australians and New Zealanders. Some served as medical staff, and others were Australian soldiers who served on other fronts but were decorated with Serbian medals. I should also mention that a few donors and journalists who helped Serbia with writing articles asking for people to donate money towards helping Serbia were also decorated by Serbia for their work, and people who donated money, like Olive King's father and so on, were also decorated. Next slide. There is a literary inheritance from the Australians who served with the Serbs in World War I. I've tried to put a representative sample of this in my books. The Australian author Miles Franklin wrote a memoir called Nemari Ništa, 6 months with the Serbs. She picked this up from the Serbian orderlies in the hospitals. They always said, Nemari ništa, sestra, Nemari ništa. So she named her memoir of her service with the Serbs, Nemari ništa, 6 months with the Serbs. And she also wrote a play called Under Far Kamakchalan. And we're going to steal that title and making this documentary about this visit and what happened in World War I. Next slide is dealing with Olive King and with her friend, and I'm going to leave that to the ambassador. So we'll go next slide. Olive also left a legacy, which I'll also leave to the ambassador, including poems and so on. We go to the next slide. The book, therefore, uses the artworks of foreign as well as Serbian artists to tell the story of what happened in Serbia and what the Australians and, of course, what the Serbs saw and what they experienced in the war. So it's an attempt to make it a look that is not just dry text, such as the previous books, but to look at it through the eyes of artists, both foreign and Serbian. Next slide. So, why record and commemorate any of this stuff? Well, the Australian and Serbian histories were incomplete because none of them dealt with this topic. It was just simply unknown. The story of the Australians and New Zealanders needs to join our national records and our memories and our commemorations. It is also vital for families of these people, of these 1,500 Australians and New Zealanders who served with the Serbs in some sort of capacity or alongside the Serbs in the Salonika front and the Serbian campaign in general. It is also important for several 100,000 people now who live in Australia who are either directly or indirectly or partly of Serbian descent. And I would say also it's a significant aspect of the war that people in Serbia should be aware of. So in summary, I believe that the service of these Australians and New Zealanders with the Serbs, who they admired and got on with well, deserves to be remembered and commemorated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pajic. Yesterday I had the opportunity to hear your presentation. It was a pleasure and I believe everyone enjoyed it. Now, in honor of the brave Australians who served Serbia during this war, I am proud to announce their descendants. So now we will hear from them about the path of their family members who were in this war and also their connection to our people. So today we have Miss Kathy Hancock and Mr. Richard Cook.
Dobra večer, everybody. When I came here tonight, I thought I was going to read, but I was told that reading bores everybody and sends them to sleep. So I'm going to play it by ear, as they say in English, which means play it without a plan, or go without a plan. So, we all know that fashions come and go. And I want to tell you about a story when Serbia, well, not the story, but the truth, that Serbia was very fashionable. So to get to that point, let's go back to the start of World War I, and you know, better than I do, that Serbia had some pretty quick military victories over the Austrians. So meanwhile, on the Western Front, England was bogged down literally in the mud and wasn't going very fast any place. So there was this news of Serbia winning, and plus at the same time Serbia needed help because they wanted munitions and so on. And so the patriotism of the day involved help for Serbia, and in Bojan's book he's reproduced pictures of some of the posters at the time asking for help for Serbia. So this arrested the British public's interest, and all of a sudden Serbia became a fashionable topic. So people would go to lectures would suddenly spring up, to each other's houses and discuss about Serbia, and the primary school curriculum changed its content to include coverage of Serbia, and the English church, the official church, the Anglican church, started to celebrate Kosovo Day. So, and British intellectuals were championing Serbia, and members of the aristocracy. Now, you know there was this famous battle of Kalubra, I don't know how to pronounce the name, and the Serbians took a lot of Austrian prisoners. The problem was, though, that many of these prisoners had a disease called typhus. And typhus, it doesn't exist anywhere now, well, because antibiotics fix it up, gets rid of it. But in those days there was no cure. And they didn't know, people didn't know how or what made it spread between people. All they knew was that if you got it, you would likely die. And, well, certainly in Serbia, 7 out of 10 people in some Serbian towns who got it were dead after 3 days. And it was an agonising death. Fever, pain, backache, stomach pain, delirium, and so on. And of course, because of the 1912 war in Serbia and these Austrian invasions, a lot of Serbia had lost a lot of its doctors and nurses. So the Serbian Red Cross put out an international appeal for help. Now, many countries came to help Serbia at that time. Boyan, who's the expert, reminded me that countries from France and Russia, I think, sent some missions to Serbia, but especially they came from England. And what happened was, it was women, upper class women especially, who suddenly thought, well, we're going to organise and help Serbia. So they started fundraising, and I might be stealing some of Kathy Hancock's thunder, but there was one group called the Scottish Women's Hospital Unit. It was run by a woman, started by a woman doctor who couldn't get a job in the British Army because they said, there's no place for women doctors in our army, you go home and do the knitting. But she was a feminist. And so she started with other women, her own medical organisation, and it was paid for by people asking for donations on the streets. And anyway, Kathy knows more about that. So in my grandmother's case, she joined something called the British Red Cross. What had happened for my grandmother, she was 29, she was single, she'd left Australia, she'd trained as a nurse in Victoria, Australia, and she's sailing to England. Actually, she was, should I summarise this a bit or keep going? Her passage was being paid to look after a doctor who caught syphilis, and he was going mad. And they're going to England for, hopefully for a magic cure. But anyway, war was declared and the boat had to go this way and that way to escape the German submarines. Anyway, she got to England and she joined the British Red Cross, and she joined a unit going to Vanashka Banya. Well, that's where she ended up. So she got a train across France and a yacht across the Mediterranean Sea, train up to Vanashka Banya. And there, Ethel, she treated the local population for typhus and the soldiers, and for other medical ailments as well. Where am I going? So Ethel wrote a letter and to her sister, and she wrote the letter after she had left Serbia, and I'm going to read bits and pieces from her letter because I want her words to speak rather than my words. So what happened was that she was enjoying her time in Vanashka Banya, and I mean Vanashka Banya was an ideal place to go because the villas there. There was lots of villas there, big rooms for creating hospitals and treating the patients on a train line. And actually, there's probably another slide there. Is there another slide there that shows a picture of my grandmother? If we go back one, can we go back one? There she is. That's my grandmother. Now, I never met her because she died just before I was born. But when I first met Boyan, and he had this interest in Serbian history, and I knew my grandmother had been in Serbia, I went crazy trying to find out what had happened to her. So anyway, I was so crazy I'd get stuck on the computer and forget to cook meals for my kids at the time. Anyway, so Ethel wrote to her sister in Geelong about the Austrian invasion. So most of her letters about the invasion, yes? So I'll read some bits and pieces from her letter. And it says, here's one piece, it says, "We got no letters, nor authentic news. Then after a time, refugees from other British missions, as well as Serbians, came pouring into the town, and into the hospital came numbers of wounded. I, having charge of the hospital where all the worst cases were brought, was loving my work and the nice Serb soldiers." Now, I use the word their missions because the British people called all their sort of support organisations that went to Serbia, they called them missions. As the sound of the guns grew nearer, Ethel went on to say, "We had a torrid time of uncertainty and waiting. Some of our party decided to trek and escape being taken. Supposing I had had the option, which I had not being supposed strong enough, I doubt if I could have left my unit, and more important, my patients." So what was happening was, the Germans and the Austrians and the Bulgarians were attacking Serbia. The Serbian army was retreating, and you know that a lot of them had to cross the Albanian mountains to the Mediterranean, and many, many died. So my grandmother was faced with a choice, as were the other British nurses, because it's mainly women we're talking about, whether to leave with the Serbian army and cross the mountains, or be captured. My grandmother decided to be captured, as most of them did. And then she goes on and she says, "Finally, on November the 10th, 1915, Austrian soldiers," well, she didn't say this, I'm saying this, "Austrian soldiers entered Vanashka Banja." Ethel said, continued, "We had all kinds of false alarms and heart-tending scenes too, as we shut our eyes or assisted Serb soldiers who were equal to it to escape. Poor fellows, if they managed to escape the search, which the Austrians afterwards made of the surrounding hills, they must have died of their wounds, which were all more or less septic, or of exposure. I really worked hard during those first weeks of the invasion, and my eyes were seldom dry." So in other words, a lot of Serbian soldiers in the hospitals who were strong enough, who felt strong enough, wanted to escape because they thought they were going to be killed. And she's saying that they were sick really, and if they left the hospital, and it was this winter coming on, they would have died. After a little time, the Austrians told the hospitals that all the Serbian soldiers had to leave, and apparently they were going to go to Kruševac and Belgrade. So the hospital, Vanashka Banja, was being emptied. Vanashka Banja didn't see any fighting, but they certainly saw a big invasion happening. And Ethel wrote, "Soldiers who had fought bravely and had borne their wounds and defeat so cheerfully, wept like children as they thanked us and bade us goodbye. It seems to me that never will a mental picture of those bullock carts going slowly down the hill, bearing away our poor wounded Serbs, fade from my memory." And actually, I forgot to ask for the slide. If we can go to the next slide. Of course, the most common form of transport in Serbia at the time, as I understand it, in addition to trains, was the bullock cart. And we've got a picture of a bullock cart there. It's not a very good quality one, but the nurse in the middle was a friend of my grandmother's. And there's a picture there of an operating room in one of the villas in Vanashka Banja. My grandmother went on with her letter, and I'll read this part too. "We lived very carefully on those days. Not only the Serbian but Austrian soldiers were almost starved. The civilians suffered even more. One sour black loaf, she's talking about bread, for 8 persons was the daily allowance. So what the nurses did was they gave away their food and any blankets they had to the local Serbian community. But then she went on, but one evil morning the inevitable happened. Our stores were taken and our blankets counted. At that time, Ethel, the only food that she could eat, or that she and her sisters were given, her nursing sisters, was beans or bread, and she couldn't digest this. So she lost half her body weight, and for the rest of her life she had digestive problems. They had other problems too. They weren't allowed outside. They couldn't collect firewood. It was winter time. They were freezing. And of course they didn't know what was going to happen to them. They thought they were going to be taken to Germany and maybe work in some factories there or something like that. But the order came in January that they were to pack up and head off to Kruševac. And they're all put in a cattle car. And, well, fair enough. You know, it sort of reminds me of World War II imagery. But in this cattle car, one of them had a little stove. And for some reason, the benzene, they call it benzene, which presumably I think means petrol or something, I'm not quite sure. It leaked, and somehow as well, this caught fire. So the train's going from Vrnjačka Banja to Kruševac, and their cattle car's on fire. And one woman lost all her clothing, and they're all covered in soot, and they're all thinking they're going to die, but the train just happened to reach Kruševac, and they threw snow on the fire and put the flames out. Then they continued, at Kruševac, they were put in a room, and my grandmother said that with all these other women, for a fortnight they weren't allowed to go outside, there was no curtains, there was no mattresses. Anyway, but reading her letter, it's sort of like it's quite amazing that they would invite each other for afternoon tea. So they had they formed this sort of like rotating sort of social calendar between themselves to keep themselves sort of occupied and enjoying themselves. Oh, wind it up. Okay, I better wind it up. Okay, so anyway, my grandmother got to they ended up in Vienna, and they were told then they were going back to England, and that's the end of her. One last thing. In England, she's talking to her sister, writing to her sister, and this is the last thing I'll say. And she said, "And now it is over. I am so glad to have been through it. Glad to have done my little bit for Serbia. Poor little Serbia, how my heart aches for her and her brave people." Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. Now we will hear Mrs. Kathy.
Thank you. Good evening. I might perhaps stand because I'm not quite as tall as the gentleman. My grandmother had a twin sister, Mary, Dr. Mary de Garris, and I would like to share some of her story with you here tonight. But before I continue, I'd like to thank the Rotary Club of Belgrade, and I'd like to acknowledge our Ambassador Daniel Emery and our historian Boyan Paj for the opportunity to speak. In 1900, Mary was one of the first generation of female medical students admitted into medicine at Melbourne Uni. Due to the old school networks, it was often difficult for female graduates to establish a private practice in capital cities. And this resulted in medical women starting their careers in rural areas. Mary practiced in outback Australia. She applied to enlist in the Australian Army but was refused. The Army at that time did not accept women other than nurses, masseurs and ward assistants. Determined to offer her services, Mary paid her own fare and she sailed to the UK. Mary joined the Scottish Women's Hospitals in 1916 to serve as a surgeon in their 4th Serbian unit, known as the America Unit, as it was funded by donations from America. Aged 36, Mary was based in Ostrovo from February 1917 until October 1918. She treated mainly Serbian soldiers, but also the wounded from the Allied armies, along with injured enemy soldiers from Germany, Austria and Bulgaria. The field hospital camp consisted of around 50 women, aged between 25 and 45 years. Women were driving the ambulances. They maintained the motor vehicles, and they worked as hospital orderlies, assisted by Serbian army orderlies and mechanics. Mary wrote in a letter back home to her twin sister, my grandmother, and she wrote, "The hospital was under canvas in a most beautiful site. It was in a valley close to the lake of Ostrovo. By the camp were numerous beech elms, providing welcome shade in the burning sun of summer. Ostrovo was notable for its variety of wildflowers, including crocuses, primroses and fields of poppies. The camp consisted of 50 large tents, housing theatres, X-ray storehouses, garages, kitchens and mess halls. Whilst the 200 patients were housed 10 to a tent. While the hospital was located some kilometres from the battlefront, the dressing stations were close to the action. As well as being subject to constant air raids, Mary faced flies and mosquitoes while performing surgery, in all weather conditions, including snow. The types of operations were various, including amputations, bomb and bullet wounds. And the surgeon's skills were often tested. Surgical fluids froze in the winter, and so the surgeons were often dressed in fur coats to perform their operations. Mary spoke to her patients in Serbian. She provided a snapshot of her patients in one of her wards, she said. She wrote, "There were 2 Serbs, one requiring a plating of the leg, the other a wound to the hand, a Turk with both eyeballs excised, and a Canadian whose hips had been dislocated." Despite the many difficulties in camp, Mary recounted the cheerfulness that existed. There were dress-up parties, special dinners, and trips to the surrounding areas were popular. Mary particularly enjoyed the Serbian mass singing, and she learnt how to dance the national dance, the kolo. In September 1917, Mary was appointed the Chief Medical Officer, and she was now responsible for some 250 people. She was known as a tireless and energetic worker, which became evident on a winter's night in February 1918 when a severe storm swept through the camp, almost demolishing it. 100 patients were taken away by ambulance and evacuated by train. Tents collapsed and medical supplies were scattered and broken. Under Mary's direction, the camp was almost restored within 3 days. Medicine was integral to the military operations. Other than surgery, the Scottish Women's Hospitals advised both the military and the government on how to manage public health issues such as infectious diseases, and the disposal of corpses. Mary's war service was recognised by both the Serbian and British governments. She was awarded the Medal of St. Sava, 3rd class, by the Serbian government. For the rest of her life, however, Mary remained unrecognised by the Australian government for her war service. On her return home to Australia, Mary established a successful medical practice in Geelong, Victoria, from 1920 until 1958, when she retired at age 77. She was the city's first female obstetrician, and by 1938 she had an outstanding record of 1,000 births without the loss of a single mother or child. And this was before antibiotics and blood transfusions were mainstream. She was small in stature and modest. At times, the nurses mistook her for the cleaner or a visitor. I met Mary only once when I was a child of 9. A bespectacled woman, I recall her warmth and hospitality. And I especially remember the fondness that my mother spoke of Mary. Her modest gravestone reads, "Beloved Auntie Doc." And I'm very proud to stand in your beautiful country here today and represent my family in honouring Mary. Thank you.
Now, we have the honor to listen to His Excellency, Mr. Daniel Emery. He wanted to be at the end, so he can talk more about olive kelso king.
Thank you very much. I would first like to thank the Rotary Club for taking the initiative to arrange this event tonight and for inviting us here. It's a pleasure and honour for me to be here with you tonight. We've heard already tonight about the wonderful contribution of Australian female medical personnel, doctors and nurses, to the Serbian war effort during the First World War. Tonight I'd like to say a few words about one of the most famous, one of the most prominent and one of the most courageous of those women, Olive King, about whom we have an exhibition which you can see upstairs in this hotel. Olive King is famous for many things, but she was the only Australian woman ever to have seen active service with the Serbian army during the First World War. In addition to her war service, she played a crucial role in providing humanitarian assistance to Serbs in need in the very difficult period that followed the war. First, I'll just say a few words about her background before the war. She was born in Sydney in 1885. Her father was a successful businessman and philanthropist. She was a highly educated woman. She completed her education in Australia first and then later in Switzerland and Germany, where she demonstrated a really strong flair for learning foreign languages. She was a very adventurous and a very strong-willed woman, and even before the war, she was an accomplished mountaineer, adventurer, traveller, rally driver and motor mechanic. This was really quite extraordinary at a time when most women were expected to play a much more traditional kind of domestic role. At the beginning of the First World War, she was living in England. She was very enthusiastic and very eager to get involved in the war effort in some way, and she, as soon as she could, she joined as a volunteer the Allied Field Ambulance Corps, which was an all-volunteer field ambulance service, which she joined in early 1915. To do this, she purchased her own ambulance vehicle. It was a truck that she bought, which she had converted into an ambulance, which was capable of seating 16 patients. She called it Ella, which was short for elephant. You'll see in the photos upstairs there's some very impressive images of that vehicle. She then took her Ella to the front in Belgium to begin work as an ambulance driver. Unfortunately, there was some kind of misunderstanding where she was falsely accused of being a spy. So she had to leave Belgium, but then she joined the Scottish Women's Hospital in May of 1915. She then went to work on the Western Front in France, where she was transporting injured soldiers to field hospitals. In October of that year, her unit was transferred to Salonika, or Solun, to work there and support the effort from that city. On the Salonika front, she provided medical assistance primarily to Serbs who'd been injured in fighting with Bulgarians, Austrians, Germans and others. After the retreat to Salonika, the Scottish Women's Hospital established a network of tent hospitals in and around the city, where Olive continued to work for the next year and a half. In the middle of 1916, she resigned from the Scottish Women's Hospital and enlisted in the Serbian army as an ambulance driver. She was attached to the headquarters of the Serbian Army Medical Service and eventually rose to the rank of sergeant in the Serbian army. She had also managed to retain her own ambulance vehicle, Ella, which she brought with her, and despite all its frequent mechanical problems, many of which she was able to repair herself. Her ambulance was only one of 3 available to the medical headquarters unit at that time. She later acquired a smaller vehicle which was better suited to the difficult driving conditions in the field there. Despite being confronted daily with the horrors of war, including transporting large numbers of very badly wounded soldiers, Olive revelled in the danger and excitement of service and in her ability to make a difference, to make a positive contribution. She frequently travelled to the front, transporting men and recovering wounded. She continued that work until the end of the war. As the war reached its final stages in 1918, Olive became increasingly distressed by the conditions in Serbia for the soldiers and their families. Although the end of the war marked a new chapter for many of Olive's medical colleagues, for Olive, relief work in Serbia continued. Once the victory parades had faded away, the grim realities of the war's aftermath, the devastation, disruption and chaos could not be denied. Prisoners of war and refugees had to be repatriated. Agricultural areas of the country were ruined. Transport services and communications had broken down. Olive plunged into her post-war relief work in Serbia. She was generously endowed by her father, who was very wealthy, and the people of Sydney. She set up a number of mobile canteens, providing food, clothing and medical supplies for the most needy. Her father had formed a committee in Sydney to raise funds to establish what was called the Australian Serbian Canteens. By early 1919, the first 2 canteens had been opened here in Belgrade and in Niš. By the winter of 1919, there were others in Kragujevac, Kraljevo, Slavonski Brod, Dubrovnik, Skopje, Herceg Novi, Kotor, Sarajevo and Baja, which is in Hungary now. The canteens were finally closed in March of 1920, but Olive's philanthropic efforts did not end there. Before she left the country, she made sizable donations from remaining trust funds to Belgrade University, the Children's Hospital in Sremska Kamenica, and a number of humanitarian organisations in Sarajevo. The story of this amazing adventurer, this woman of action, would make a great film. But no film script, particularly for Hollywood, would be complete without an element of romance. And Olive's story, I'm pleased to say, is no exception. Early in 1916, a large pothole brought Olive's ambulance to a standstill. On that auspicious day, a polite and inquisitive Serbian officer offered his assistance to the stranded Olive to help her get her ambulance back on the road. The Serbian officer was Captain Milan Jovicic, who was the Serbian liaison officer with the British Army in Salonika. He and Olive became firm friends, and before long the friendship evolved into a romance. Whenever they could, they spent time together, talking, dining, dancing in one of the local cafes. The pair were said to be inseparable. But alas, a Hollywood happy ending was not to be. One day, Milan confessed that he could not marry Olive because he had already been promised to someone else. His parents had arranged the match to a woman with ancestral links to the royal family, and the plan was for them to marry as soon as the war had finished. Nevertheless, they remained good friends and continued to exchange letters for many years. Olive King returned to Serbia for the last time in 1922 when she was invited back as a guest of King Alexander at his wedding. Back in Australia, Olive continued her life of community service. When the Second World War started, she volunteered again to serve as an ambulance driver, but unfortunately she was rejected because of her age. Instead, she worked in an aircraft factory as an inspector and contributed to the war effort in that way. She died in 1958. For her service in Serbia and with Serbian forces, she received 4 awards. The Serbian Medal for Zealous Service, gold, a medal for bravery for action rescuing civilians and medical stores during the Great Salonika Fire in August of 1917, the Order of St. Sava, Class 5, for her humanitarian work after the war, and a Cross of Mercy for her ambulance work. I think you would all agree that she was a truly extraordinary figure, a unique and very brave woman, and a true hero for both Serbia and Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I would encourage you to all look at the exhibition when you're here, and the little booklet about her life that accompanies the exhibition. Please feel free to take one. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this inspiring lecture. Before we close this formal part, I would like to call a member of our club, Milan Milkovic. He is going to read a song that Olive Kelso-King wrote it for her biggest love, Milan Jovicic. I hope Mr. Pajc doesn't mind if he reads from his book. He has already. Milane?
Nadam se da me čujete i vi pozadnje. Pročitat ću jedan kratak deo iz knjige gospodina Bojana Pajića i jednu kratku pesmu koju je napisala Olive King. Tokom ratne službe Olive King je upoznala oficira srpske vojske Milana Jovicića, koga je zvala Jovi. Milan Jovicić je bio srpski oficir za vezu sa štabom britanske armije u Solunu. Među njima se rodila ljubav i bili su zajedno sve dok on nije otišao za službom u London. Nakon njihovog poslednjeg susreta na kraljevskom venčanju u Beogradu 1922. godine, Helen King je napisala pesmu. Ako ti se ne vratim, već prva napustim ovaj svet, sam. Ne tražim od tebe da mi budeš vera, niti da okreneš glavu kada vidiš neku drugu. Ne, reći ću ti, zaboravi me, dragi. Nemoj nositi crninu za mnom. Možda će nam se putevi opet ukrstiti, kada i ti pređeš u drugi svet. Uživaj u slatkim trenucima mladosti, kratkovečnima, kao i sve što je lepo. Moraš spoznati tužnu istinu. Nema te suze koja može oživeti prošlost. Ipak, neka tvoji povici ne budu odveć glasni, da uplaše moju jadnu dušu koja luta, pa da u strahu da ti ne naudi, ne potraži tvoju dušu u kojoj se nekad ogledala. A ti se katkad, u trenutku čeži, prisjeti kako su nam se ruke nekad davno srele, prepusti se silini tog osjećaja i zaboravi da sam te molila da me zaboraviš. Olive King i Milan Jovicić nikada se više nisu sreli, ali su godinama razmenjivali pisma i Olive je držala njegovu fotografiju kraj svog uzglavlja. Na toj fotografiji Jovi je svojom rukom napisao posvetu. Moje malenoj dragoj sa iskrenom ljubavlju. Milan Jovi, 21. april
Thank you, Milan. Last but not least, we are delighted to welcome Mr. Miloš Jevdić. Miloš tonight has a double reason to celebrate. He is going to become a member of our club, but also it's his birthday tonight. So please, President, if you can applause, please, for Miloš.
First, do you want to first introduce yourself, or?
Thank you all. I'm going to be brief. Sorry. My name is Miloš. I'm really honored to become a member of this amazing organization, and I'm looking forward to growing with you and to doing some really amazing things in the future. Thank you all.
Welcome to our club. Thank you all.
Thank you, Miloš. It is a pleasure to have you with us in our team. Now, I would like to thank all of our guests for being tonight with us. And I know that you have a really busy schedule, especially Mr. Richard, Mr. Kathy, Mr. Pajć, because they're coming all the way from Australia. So we really appreciate that. And wherever you're coming to Serbia, you're always welcome in our club, but also I know in all district, because here we have a lot of Rotarians and Rotaractors. So you're always welcome. Of course, Your Excellency, you know that you're always welcome with us, and we're going to work on exhibition about Olive for sure. Now we will all continue in the lobby hotel. You will have also the chance to try some sweet cakes. And for that, I will have to thank Amira and her sister Hannah and their Princess Factory of Sweets, because they made that all just for us tonight. Also, I can't forget about special lady, and she's right there, Mrs. Irena Milojković. She helped us a lot with organization of this event, the topic, and with the ambassador and our guests. So I'm really thankful for that, and I really appreciate that. Thank you all, and I hope really that you enjoyed tonight with us.